What if I told you that what happened in Venezuela on January 3rd was planned 20 years ago? That classified documents from 2006 already outlined exactly how this operation would unfold? That the president who was just captured knew it was coming and couldn't stop it? And that what we're witnessing right now is not a spontaneous military action, but the final move in a game that started over a century ago? Listen carefully. In 1902, Venezuela was surrounded by warships. European empires demanded payment.
Roosevelt Corollary asserts our duty to intervene in Latin America to maintain stability and protect our interests.
But something happened that year that created a doctrine, a policy, a blueprint for American intervention that has been used over and over and over again. Cuba, Nicaragua, Panama, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Guatemala, Chile, Grenada, Iraq, Libya. The pattern repeats. And now Venezuela. But this time it's different. This time they didn't just overthrow a government from the shadows. They did it in broad daylight. They captured a president and flew him across international borders. They killed dozens of people in a military strike on a capital city. And they're telling us it's about drugs, about democracy, about security. But if you follow the oil, if you follow the alliances, if you follow the history, you'll see something else entirely. You'll see that January 3rd, 2026 wasn't just about removing Nicolás Maduro. It was about sending a message to every nation on earth. A message written in the blood of Venezuelan soldiers. A message heard in Moscow, in Beijing, in Tehran, in every capital that has ever dared to defy American power. And the message is simple. Sovereignty is an illusion when we decide it is. Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see everything happening in the world right now. From Ukraine to Taiwan, from the South China Sea to the Middle East. It's all connected, and Venezuela is where the mask finally came off. Today we explore one of the most dramatic escalations in modern global politics. The United States just attacked Venezuela, captured its president, and triggered a major international crisis. But to understand how this came to be, we need to rewind all the way back over a century to a moment that defined how superpowers treat smaller nations, a moment that set the template for everything that followed. What you're about to discover is not just about a military operation in 2026, but about a pattern of power that has repeated itself across generations, a pattern that began with warships blockading a Caribbean nation over debt, and has now culminated in the most controversial military action of the 21st century. This is the story of Venezuela, caught between empires then and superpowers now, and the question that haunts every analysis. Are we witnessing history repeat itself, or are we watching something far more dangerous unfold? On January 3rd, 2026, the world woke to news that seemed impossible, almost surreal in its audacity. United States military forces launched a massive strike against Venezuela, penetrating deep into the nation's capital. Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, were captured in an operation that involved special forces, precision airstrikes, and intelligence coordination that had clearly been planned for months, perhaps years. They were extracted from Venezuelan soil and flown directly to the United States to face charges related to drug trafficking, corruption, and crimes against humanity. The operation was swift, brutal, and executed with the kind of overwhelming force that left the Venezuelan military unable to mount any meaningful resistance. But the cost in human lives was immediate and devastating. Dozens of Venezuelan military personnel were killed in the fighting, along with members of allied forces who had been stationed in the country. Cuba, Venezuela's closest ally, reported casualties among its military advisors, turning this from a bilateral crisis into a regional confrontation. The images that emerged in the hours following the operation showed burning buildings in Caracas, military installations reduced to rubble, and a nation in shock, unable to comprehend how quickly its government had been decapitated. American officials defended the action as a necessary counter-narcotics operation, claiming that the Maduro regime had transformed Venezuela into a narco-state that posed a direct threat to United States national security. But to much of the world, what they witnessed looked less like a police action and more like an act of war. a violation of sovereignty so brazen that it threatened the entire framework of international law that has governed relations between nations since the end of World War II. The global reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session within hours of the operation, with representatives from dozens of nations rising to condemn what they called an illegal invasion and an act of aggression that violated the UN Charter. Russia's ambassador called it naked imperialism and drew parallels to the worst excesses of colonial-era power politics. China's representative warned that the operation set a dangerous precedent that could destabilize the entire international order. Even traditional American allies expressed deep concern, with several European nations calling for restraint and demanding that the United States provide a clear legal justification for its actions under international law. The condemnation was not limited to geopolitical rivals. It came from across the ideological spectrum, from nations that had no particular love for the Maduro regime but recognized that the principle at stake was larger than any single government. If a superpower could simply invade another nation, capture its leadership, and transport them across borders to face trial in foreign courts, then what protection did sovereignty offer any nation? What prevented the strong from doing whatever they wished to the weak? These questions echoed through diplomatic corridors and news broadcasts around the world, and they remain unanswered. Within the United States itself, public opinion was deeply divided. Polls conducted in the days following the operation showed that while some Americans supported the action as a blow against drug cartels and authoritarian regimes, a significant portion expressed opposition or uncertainty. Many questioned whether the operation was worth the cost, whether it would achieve its stated objectives, and whether it might drag the United States into yet another prolonged military engagement in a foreign land. The debate revealed deep fissures in American society about the proper role of military power, about when intervention is justified, and about whether the lessons of Iraq, Afghanistan, and other interventions had been learned or forgotten. But this crisis did not emerge from nowhere. To understand what happened on January 3, 2026, we must travel back more than a century, to another moment when Venezuela found itself at the center of a confrontation between great powers, a moment that shaped the entire trajectory of American foreign policy in Latin America. In 1902, Venezuela was a nation in chaos. General Cipriano Castro had seized power 3 years earlier, inheriting a government drowning in debt and fighting a massive internal rebellion. The country owed nearly 190 million bolívares to foreign creditors, approximately $38 million at the time, a sum that Venezuela had no capacity to repay. Castro, facing civil war and economic collapse, made a fateful decision. He refused to recognize the foreign debts, arguing that Venezuela could not be held responsible for obligations incurred by previous corrupt regimes. The response from Europe was swift and uncompromising. Britain, Germany, and Italy formed a coalition and issued an ultimatum: pay the debts or face the consequences. When Castro refused, the three powers implemented a naval blockade, seizing Venezuelan ships, sinking gunboats, and bombarding the port of Puerto Cabello. What began as economic coercion quickly escalated into military action, with German forces shelling Fort San Carlos and occupying Venezuelan territory. The crisis sent shockwaves through the Western Hemisphere because it represented exactly what the United States feared most: European military intervention in the Americas, a violation of the principles that American policymakers had been trying to enforce since the Monroe Doctrine was first articulated in 1823. President Theodore Roosevelt watched the Venezuelan crisis with growing alarm. Initially, he had been willing to tolerate European pressure on Venezuela, believing that nations should be held accountable for their debts, and that the United States should not shield irresponsible governments from the consequences of their actions. But as the blockade turned into bombardment, as German forces moved from coercion to occupation, Roosevelt's calculus changed. Intelligence reports suggested that Germany might be seeking more than debt repayment. There were rumors of plans to establish permanent naval bases in the Caribbean, to use the Venezuelan crisis as an opportunity to project German power into a region that the United States considered its sphere of influence. The strategic implications were enormous. The United States was planning to build a canal across Central America, a canal that would revolutionize global trade and naval strategy. And the last thing American planners wanted was a hostile European power established on the approaches to that canal. Roosevelt responded by concentrating the United States battle fleet near Puerto Rico, 53 warships in total, a show of force designed to send an unmistakable message. Territorial seizure would mean war. Whether Roosevelt delivered an explicit ultimatum to Germany remains a matter of historical debate. But the effect was clear. The European powers, recognizing that the United States was prepared to fight, agreed to submit the dispute to international arbitration. In February 1903, the crisis was resolved through the Washington Protocols, with Venezuela agreeing to dedicate 30% of its customs revenue to debt repayment. The guns fell silent, the warships departed, and on the surface, it appeared that diplomacy had triumphed. But Roosevelt was deeply dissatisfied with the outcome, because the settlement had rewarded gunboat diplomacy and had established a precedent that any nation with sufficient naval power could coerce smaller nations in the Americas. Later in 1903, Roosevelt articulated what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, a policy declaration that would shape American interventions in Latin America for the next century. The corollary stated that the United States had the right and the duty to exercise international police power in the Western Hemisphere, to intervene in the affairs of Latin American nations to prevent European intervention, to enforce stability, and to ensure that these nations met their international obligations. On paper, it was presented as a way to protect Latin American sovereignty from European imperialism. In practice, it became the justification for decades of American military interventions, occupations, and political manipulations throughout Central America and the Caribbean. The United States invaded Cuba, occupied Haiti and the Dominican Republic, intervened repeatedly in Nicaragua, and influenced elections and governments across the region. The pattern was consistent. Economic interests were threatened, instability emerged, American forces intervened to restore order, and American-friendly governments were installed. The Roosevelt Corollary transformed the United States from a nation that proclaimed the sovereignty of the Americas into a nation that acted as the hemisphere's self-appointed enforcer, judge, and when necessary, executioner of governments it deemed unacceptable. And Venezuela, the nation whose crisis had sparked this policy shift, would find itself subject to American influence for the next 100 years, its politics shaped by the knowledge that the superpower to the north considered it within its sphere of control. Fast forward to 2026, and the echoes of 1902 are unmistakable. Then it was European empires pressuring Venezuela over debts and demanding compliance through naval blockade. Today, it is a Western superpower launching a military strike to remove a government it considers illegitimate and threatening. The justifications have changed, debt collection has been replaced by counter-narcotics operations and human rights concerns, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same. A powerful nation using military force to impose its will on a weaker neighbor. The capture of Nicolás Maduro is not just a tactical operation. It represents a complete shift in regional control, a demonstration that the United States is willing to go far beyond economic sanctions or diplomatic isolation when it deems a government sufficiently threatening to its interests. And make no mistake, Venezuela's interests are substantial. The nation possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, larger even than those of Saudi Arabia, reserves that have been the source of both Venezuela's wealth and its curse. For decades, control over Venezuelan oil has been a strategic prize, and the Maduro regime's alliance with Russia, China, and Cuba, its willingness to sell oil to American adversaries, and to use its resources to fund anti-American movements throughout Latin America, had made it a target of increasing American hostility. The Trump administration had imposed crippling sanctions, recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó as the legitimate president, and openly called for regime change. But sanctions alone had not dislodged Maduro. The Venezuelan economy collapsed, hyperinflation destroyed the currency, millions of Venezuelans fled the country as refugees, and yet the regime survived, propped up by oil revenue, Russian and Chinese support, and a security apparatus willing to use extreme violence to maintain control. The Biden administration continued the pressure, adding new sanctions and increasing support for opposition movements, but by 2025, it had become clear that sanctions were causing immense suffering for ordinary Venezuelans while doing little to weaken Maduro's grip on power. The question facing American policymakers was stark: accept the reality of a hostile, anti-American regime controlling vast oil reserves on the northern coast of South America, or escalate to military action. The decision to escalate, when it came, appears to have been driven by a combination of factors. Intelligence suggesting that Venezuela was becoming a hub for international drug trafficking networks connected to Mexican cartels, concerns about Chinese and Russian military presence in the country, reports of human rights abuses on a massive scale, and pressure from domestic political constituencies demanding action. But underlying all of these factors was the same calculation that had driven Roosevelt's Corollary in 1903. The belief that the United States had the right and the responsibility to determine who governed nations within its sphere of influence, and the willingness to use military force to enforce that determination. The operation on January 3rd was presented to the American public as a surgical strike against a criminal regime, a limited action with specific objectives. But the reality on the ground is far more complex and far more dangerous than official statements acknowledge. Venezuela has not simply accepted the removal of its president and the decapitation of its government. In the days since the operation, armed militias loyal to Maduro have taken control of portions of Caracas. Gun battles have erupted between different factions of the Venezuelan military, some supporting the American intervention, others resisting it. National Bolivarian Militia, a paramilitary organization with hundreds of thousands of members, has vowed to resist what it calls an invasion and occupation. The Biden administration continued the pressure, adding new sanctions and increasing support for opposition movements, but by 2025, it had become clear that sanctions were causing immense suffering for ordinary Venezuelans while doing little to weaken Maduro's grip on power. The question facing American policymakers was stark: accept the reality of a hostile, anti-American regime controlling vast oil reserves on the northern coast of South America, or escalate to military action. The decision to escalate, when it came, appears to have been driven by a combination of factors. Intelligence suggesting that Venezuela was becoming a hub for international drug trafficking networks connected to Mexican cartels, concerns about Chinese and Russian military presence in the country, reports of human rights abuses on a massive scale, and pressure from domestic political constituencies demanding action. But underlying all of these factors was the same calculation that had driven Roosevelt's Corollary in 1903. The belief that the United States had the right and the responsibility to determine who governed nations within its sphere of influence, and the willingness to use military force to enforce that determination. The operation on January 3rd was presented to the American public as a surgical strike against a criminal regime, a limited action with specific objectives. But the reality on the ground is far more complex and far more dangerous than official statements acknowledge. Venezuela has not simply accepted the removal of its president and the decapitation of its government. In the days since the operation, armed militias loyal to Maduro have taken control of portions of Caracas. Gun battles have erupted between different factions of the Venezuelan military, some supporting the American intervention, others resisting it. National Bolivarian Militia, a paramilitary organization with hundreds of thousands of members, has vowed to resist what it calls an invasion and occupation. The situation has created a power vacuum that multiple actors are now rushing to fill. Opposition groups that had been suppressed under Maduro are attempting to assert authority, but they have little control over the security forces or the armed population. Regional powers are positioning themselves to influence whatever government emerges from the chaos. Cuba has condemned the operation in the strongest possible terms and has hinted that it may provide support to resistance movements. Brazil, despite its complex relationship with Venezuela, has expressed concern about stability on its northern border and has increased military deployments along the frontier. Colombia, historically an American ally, has offered qualified support for the operation but is deeply worried about the spillover effects of Venezuelan instability, particularly the flow of refugees and the activities of drug trafficking organizations that operate across the border. And beyond Latin America, Russia and China have both issued statements condemning the American action and warning of consequences. Neither nation is in a position to provide direct military support to Venezuela, but both have strategic interests in demonstrating that they will stand by their allies, and both are capable of making American interests more difficult in other parts of the world. The Syrian conflict, tensions in the South China Sea, cyber operations, diplomatic maneuvering at the United Nations. There are countless ways that great power competition can manifest, and the Venezuelan crisis has added fuel to fires that were already burning. The risk of escalation, of this crisis spinning out into broader regional or even global confrontation is real and growing. What makes the 2026 Venezuelan crisis particularly dangerous is that it is occurring at a moment when the international order is already under severe strain. The post-World War II system, built on the principles of sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and the prohibition on the use of force except in self-defense or with Security Council authorization, has been eroding for decades. The United States itself has contributed to this erosion through interventions in Iraq, Libya, and other nations, interventions that were controversial and that set precedents other nations have noted. Russia's annexation of Crimea and invasion of Ukraine demonstrated that territorial conquest was not a relic of the past. China's increasingly assertive posture in the South China Sea has raised questions about freedom of navigation and international law. And now the Venezuelan operation adds another crack in the foundation, another instance where raw power trumped legal norms, where a strong nation did what it wished because it could, and because it believed its interests justified the action. The defenders of the operation argue that Maduro's crimes were so egregious, his regime so destructive to the Venezuelan people and so threatening to regional stability, that extraordinary measures were justified. They point to the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, the millions of refugees, the collapse of basic services, the reports of torture and extrajudicial killings, and they argue that the international community had a responsibility to act. They note that years of sanctions and diplomatic pressure had failed, that Maduro showed no willingness to negotiate or reform, and that ultimately force was the only option remaining. And they emphasize the counter-narcotics dimension, the evidence that Venezuela had become a transshipment point for cocaine moving from South America to markets in the United States and Europe, that high-ranking Venezuelan officials were complicit in or actively facilitating. What makes the 2026 Venezuelan crisis particularly dangerous is that it is occurring at a moment when the international order is already under severe strain. The post-World War II system, built on the principles of sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and the prohibition on the use of force except in self-defense or with Security Council authorization, has been eroding for decades. The United States itself has contributed to this erosion through interventions in Iraq, Libya, and other nations, interventions that were controversial and that set precedents other nations have noted. Russia's annexation of Crimea and invasion of Ukraine demonstrated that territorial conquest was not a relic of the past. China's increasingly assertive posture in the South China Sea has raised questions about freedom of navigation and international law. And now the Venezuelan operation adds another crack in the foundation, another instance where raw power trumped legal norms, where a strong nation did what it wished because it could, and because it believed its interests justified the action. The defenders of the operation argue that Maduro's crimes were so egregious, his regime so destructive to the Venezuelan people and so threatening to regional stability, that extraordinary measures were justified. They point to the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, the millions of refugees, the collapse of basic services, the reports of torture and extrajudicial killings, and they argue that the international community had a responsibility to act. They note that years of sanctions and diplomatic pressure had failed, that Maduro showed no willingness to negotiate or reform, and that ultimately force was the only option remaining. And they emphasize the counter-narcotics dimension, the evidence that Venezuela had become a transshipment point for cocaine moving from South America to markets in the United States and Europe, that high-ranking Venezuelan officials were complicit in or actively facilitating drug trafficking, and that dismantling this narco-state served legitimate law enforcement interests. But the critics of the operation make equally powerful arguments. They point out that humanitarian intervention and counter-narcotics operations are governed by international law, and that unilateral military action without Security Council authorization is prohibited except in cases of imminent threat to national security. They question whether the evidence of threat was sufficient to justify such an extreme response, and they note that the stated justifications have shifted over time, suggesting that the real motivations may be different from the public rationale. They worry that the operation sets a precedent that any nation with sufficient military power can invoke similar justifications to intervene in the affairs of weaker neighbors, that this is exactly the kind of might makes right logic that international law was designed to prevent. They point to the civilian casualties, the destruction of infrastructure, the chaos that has followed the operation, and they ask whether the cure is worse than the disease, whether removing Maduro has actually improved the situation for ordinary Venezuelans or simply replaced one form of suffering with another. and they raise the specter of prolonged occupation, of the United States finding itself responsible for rebuilding and governing a nation of 30 million people with a devastated economy, armed militias, and deep political divisions. Iraq and Afghanistan loom large in these critiques, reminders of what happens when military operations that are supposed to be quick and surgical turn into decade-long quagmires that cost trillions of dollars and thousands of lives while achieving ambiguous results at best. The question of what happens next in Venezuela is one that no one can answer with confidence. The immediate crisis involves establishing some form of governance in a nation whose government has been forcibly removed. The United States has indicated that it supports a transition to democratic rule, with elections to be held once security is established and political prisoners are released. But who will organize these elections? Who will ensure their legitimacy? Which factions of Venezuelan society will accept the results, and which will reject them as the product of foreign intervention? The Venezuelan opposition is deeply fractured, divided between moderate reformers who seek gradual change and radical elements who demand wholesale transformation. The military is split, with some officers willing to work with the Americans and others viewing them as invaders to be resisted. The civilian population is traumatized, impoverished, and angry, and while many Venezuelans despised Maduro and celebrated his removal, many others view the American intervention as a violation of their national dignity, an act of imperial arrogance that treats Venezuela as a colony rather than a sovereign nation. Building a stable, legitimate government from these fragments will require not just military power but political skill, economic resources, and most importantly, time. Time that the American public may not be willing to grant, time during which things can go catastrophically wrong. And there is the oil, always the oil, the vast reserves that make Venezuela strategically valuable and that complicate every aspect of the crisis. Who will control Venezuelan oil production going forward? Will it be returned to state control, privatized, open to international investment? Whatever decisions are made will have enormous implications for global energy markets, for the Venezuelan economy, and for the distribution of power within Venezuelan society. The international legal questions raised by the Venezuelan operation are profound and will be debated for years to come. The United Nations Charter is clear that the use of force is prohibited except in self-defense or when authorized by the Security Council. The United States did not seek Security Council authorization, knowing that Russia and China would veto any resolution, and has instead invoked a combination of self-defense, counter-narcotics authority, and humanitarian justifications. But do these justifications hold up under scrutiny? The self-defense claim rests on the argument that drug trafficking from Venezuela poses a threat to American national security. But this is a very expansive interpretation of self-defense that could theoretically justify military action against any nation where drug production or trafficking occurs. The counter-narcotics justification invokes international agreements and domestic legislation that authorize action against drug traffickers. But these authorities were never intended to permit the invasion of sovereign nations and the capture of their leaders. And the humanitarian justification runs into the problem that humanitarian intervention without Security Council authorization is controversial even in cases of genocide or mass atrocities, which are not clearly present in Venezuela despite the regime's many abuses. International lawyers are already arguing about whether the Venezuelan operation represents a justifiable exception to the prohibition on force or a dangerous erosion of international law. Some argue that international law must be flexible enough to address real-world security threats and humanitarian crises, that strict adherence to sovereignty rules can protect tyrants and enable atrocities. Others counter that once you start making exceptions to fundamental rules, the rules cease to have meaning, and you return to a world where power is the only law that matters. The parallels between 1902 and 2026 are striking, but so are the differences. In 1902, the Venezuelan crisis was ultimately resolved through diplomacy and arbitration. Yes, it took the threat of American military power to bring the European powers to the negotiating table, but the actual resolution was achieved through legal mechanisms and compromise. No government was overthrown, no leader was captured and transported across borders for trial. The crisis resulted in a policy doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, but that doctrine at least paid lip service to the sovereignty of Latin American nations, even as it justified American intervention. In 2026, the operation went far beyond anything contemplated in 1902. The United States did not pressure Venezuela to change its behavior. It decapitated the Venezuelan government and transported its leaders to American soil for prosecution. This is not coercion or intervention in the traditional sense. It is regime change accomplished through military force, and it raises questions about sovereignty and international order that go to the heart of how the modern world is organized. If the United States can do this to Venezuela, what prevents other powerful nations from doing the same to their weaker neighbors? What prevents China from using similar logic to justify action in Southeast Asia, Russia in Eastern Europe, regional powers in their spheres of influence? The risk is not just that the Venezuelan operation fails on its own terms, but that it contributes to a broader breakdown of international norms, a return to a world where strength matters more than law, where the weak have no protection except the benevolence of the strong. And yet, we must also grapple with the genuinely difficult questions that the Venezuelan crisis presents. What should the international community do when a government systematically abuses its population, when it creates conditions that drive millions of people to flee, when it becomes complicit in criminal enterprises that threaten regional security? Sanctions clearly did not work in Venezuela. They caused immense suffering but did not dislodge Maduro or change the regime's behavior. Diplomatic engagement went nowhere, as Maduro showed no interest in meaningful negotiations or reforms. The opposition, despite international recognition and support, could not mount an effective internal challenge to the regime. So what options remained? To accept the status quo, to tolerate a regime that most observers considered illegitimate and destructive, or to escalate to force with all the risks and moral hazards that entails. This is the tragic dilemma at the heart of the Venezuelan crisis, and it is a dilemma without easy answers. Those who oppose the operation cannot simply point to its violations of international law without offering an alternative approach that addresses the genuine problems the regime created. And those who supported the operation cannot ignore its costs, its risks, and the dangerous precedents it sets. The honest truth is that Venezuela presented a situation where all available options were bad, where every choice involved significant harms, and where the decision to act or not to act was ultimately a judgment call about which set of harms was least acceptable. For ordinary Venezuelans, the crisis is not an abstract debate about international law or great power politics. It is their homes destroyed in the fighting, their family members killed or disappeared, their future uncertain in ways that go beyond even the hardships they endured under Maduro. In the days since January 3rd, reports from Venezuela paint a picture of a nation in trauma. In some areas, people celebrated Maduro's capture, taking to the streets to express relief that the regime that had impoverished and oppressed them was finally gone. But in other areas, particularly in regions where Maduro's support was strongest, the reaction was anger and fear, a sense that their nation had been violated, that external powers had decided their fate without consulting them. Gun battles between militias and security forces have killed hundreds, possibly thousands, though accurate casualty figures are impossible to obtain in the chaos. Essential services that were already barely functioning under Maduro have collapsed entirely in many areas, leaving communities without power, water, or medical care. Food distribution networks have broken down, raising the specter of famine in a nation that was already experiencing severe malnutrition. And refugees continue to flee, now not just from the Maduro regime but from the violence and instability that followed its collapse. Colombia and Brazil are struggling to manage the influx, and tensions are rising in border regions where resources are scarce and resentment toward Venezuelan refugees was already present. The United States now faces the enormous challenge of trying to stabilize a nation whose government it destroyed, and early indications suggest that this challenge may be even more difficult than the military operation itself. American officials are working with Venezuelan opposition leaders to establish an interim government, but these leaders have limited legitimacy within Venezuela and virtually no control over the security forces or armed militias. Efforts to distribute humanitarian aid are hampered by security concerns and logistical challenges. Attempts to restart oil production are complicated by the damage to infrastructure, the exodus of skilled workers, and disputes over ownership and control. And the resistance to American presence is growing, not just from hardcore Maduro loyalists but from Venezuelans across the political spectrum who resent what they see as occupation and who believe that Venezuela's future should be determined by Venezuelans, not by Washington. There are already reports of improvised attacks against American personnel, of ambushes and bombings that suggest the emergence of an insurgency. American military planners are acutely aware that this is how quagmires begin, with an operation that was supposed to be quick and clean turning into a prolonged commitment that drains resources and political will. The question looming over everything is how long American forces will remain in Venezuela, and what the exit strategy looks like. American officials insist that the presence is temporary, that forces will be withdrawn once a stable democratic government is established. But what if stability proves elusive? What if the interim government cannot establish legitimacy, cannot control the armed factions, cannot restart the economy? Does the United States stay indefinitely, or does it withdraw and risk leaving behind a failed state on South America's northern coast? Internationally, the Venezuelan operation has accelerated trends that were already underway, trends toward a more multipolar and contested world order. Russia and China have seized on the operation to argue that the United States is a rogue actor that flouts international law when convenient, and they have used it to justify their own assertive actions in their respective regions. Russian officials have explicitly drawn parallels between the American operation in Venezuela and Russian actions in Ukraine, arguing that if the United States can invoke security concerns and humanitarian justifications to intervene militarily, then Russia can do the same in its near abroad. Chinese officials have made similar arguments regarding Taiwan, suggesting that if sovereignty can be violated in the name of security or human rights, then China's claims on Taiwan are equally valid. These are cynical arguments that ignore crucial differences in context and justification, but they are arguments that resonate in many parts of the world, particularly among nations that fear American power or that have their own reasons for challenging the post-war international order. The non-aligned movement, representing more than 100 nations, issued a statement condemning the Venezuelan operation and warning that it threatens the principle of sovereign equality that is supposed to govern relations among states. Regional organizations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America have expressed similar concerns, worried that if powerful nations can simply ignore sovereignty when it suits them, then no nation is truly safe. The fractures in the international system, already visible before January 3rd, have widened, and the prospects for cooperation on global challenges from climate change to pandemic response to nuclear proliferation have dimmed. Within the United States, the Venezuelan operation has become a focal point for deeper debates about American power and purpose in the world. Supporters see it as a necessary assertion of American interests and values, a demonstration that the United States is still willing to act decisively when its security is threatened or when humanitarian concerns demand action. They argue that decades of timidity and hesitation, of allowing hostile regimes to entrench themselves, of relying on sanctions and diplomacy that achieved nothing, had damaged American credibility and emboldened adversaries. The Venezuelan operation, in this view, sends a message that American power is real and will be used when necessary, and that message has value in deterring future challenges. But critics see something very different. They see an act of hubris, a repetition of mistakes made in Iraq and elsewhere, a belief that military power can solve complex political problems, and a disregard for international law and the sovereignty of other nations. They worry that the operation will create more problems than it solves, that it will radicalize populations throughout Latin America against the United States, that it will provide propaganda victories for American adversaries, and that it will drain resources and attention from more pressing challenges. The debate has split along political lines, but not entirely predictably. Some conservatives who normally support strong military action have expressed concern about the costs and risks of the Venezuelan operation. Some liberals who normally oppose military intervention have argued that Maduro's crimes justified extraordinary measures. The divisions reveal a deeper uncertainty in American society about what role the nation should play in the world, about whether the era of American global leadership is ending or needs to be reasserted, and about what lessons should be drawn from the successes and failures of past interventions. As we reflect on the Venezuelan crisis of 2026 and its echoes of the crisis of 1902, we are forced to confront uncomfortable questions about power, sovereignty, and the rules that govern international relations. For more than a century, from the Roosevelt Corollary to the present day, the United States has exercised enormous influence over Latin America, sometimes through diplomacy and economic engagement, sometimes through covert operations, and sometimes through overt military force. The pattern has been consistent. When American policymakers perceived a threat to American interests or values, they intervened, and the sovereignty of Latin American nations was subordinated to American priorities. This pattern was justified as necessary for hemispheric security, as a way to prevent hostile extra-hemispheric powers from gaining footholds, as a means of promoting democracy and human rights. But from the perspective of many Latin Americans, it looked different. It looked like imperialism, like the arrogant exercise of power by a northern giant that treated its southern neighbors as subordinates rather than equals. The Venezuelan operation of 2026 has revived all of these old resentments and grievances, and it has raised the question of whether anything has really changed, or whether the dynamics of 1902 are still operative, merely dressed in new language and new justifications. The historical parallel is instructive but not deterministic. In 1902, the Venezuelan crisis led to the Roosevelt Corollary, which shaped American policy for decades and justified numerous interventions. But it also eventually led to the good neighbor policy of the 1930s, when the United States began to move away from direct military intervention and toward more cooperative relationships with Latin American nations. It led to the Alliance for Progress in the 1960s, an effort to promote economic development and reduce the appeal of communism through positive engagement rather than coercion. The history of U.S.-Latin American relations has been marked by swings between intervention and engagement, between seeing the region as a sphere of control and seeing it as a partnership. The question now is which direction the Venezuelan crisis will push American policy. Will it inaugurate a new era of military intervention, with the United States increasingly willing to use force to shape outcomes throughout the hemisphere? Or will the difficulties and costs of the Venezuelan operation convince policymakers that there are limits to what military power can achieve, that sustainable solutions require local legitimacy and cannot be imposed from outside? The answer will depend on many factors: how the situation in Venezuela evolves, what lessons American policymakers draw from the experience, how other nations respond, and what crises emerge in the future that test American resolve and judgment. What is beyond question is that January 3, 2026 represents a watershed moment, a point at which the tension between sovereignty and intervention, between international law and great power prerogatives, came to a head in a way that will reverberate for years. The capture of Nicolás Maduro and the military operation that accomplished it cannot be undone. The precedent has been set, the line has been crossed, and the international community must now grapple with what it means. For Venezuela, the immediate future is uncertain and fraught with danger. The nation faces the possibility of prolonged instability, of becoming a failed state, or of eventually stabilizing under a new government that may or may not be democratic or legitimate in the eyes of its people. For the United States, the operation represents both an assertion of power and a test of strategy, a gamble that military force can achieve political objectives that other tools could not. For the international system, the operation is a challenge to norms that have been eroding for years, a reminder that in moments of crisis, powerful nations will prioritize their perceived interests over legal constraints, and that the question of how to respond to such actions remains unresolved. From Venezuela in 1902 to Venezuela in 2026, history seems to repeat when strong powers encroach on weaker nations. But the stakes now are global, the weapons more destructive, the interconnections more complex, and the legal norms supposedly more developed. In 1902, the crisis was resolved without regime change, without leaders being captured and tried in foreign courts, without the levels of violence and instability we are witnessing today. The Roosevelt Corollary that emerged from that crisis justified intervention, but it did so within limits and eventually gave way to policies that recognized the value of partnership over domination. The question that haunts the 2026 crisis is whether we will see a similar evolution, or whether we are entering a darker period, one in which might makes right, in which international law is a dead letter, and in which the sovereignty of nations means nothing when confronted by the power of a determined superpower. The Venezuelan operation may succeed in its immediate objectives, or it may fail catastrophically. But regardless of its tactical outcome, it has already succeeded in revealing the fragility of the international order and the enduring truth that when nations are weak and isolated, when they make themselves vulnerable through misgovernance and hostility, they risk becoming the objects rather than the subjects of history, their fates decided not in their own capitals but in the war rooms and situation rooms of distant powers. And so we are left with the image of warships blockading a Caribbean nation over a century ago, and Special Forces helicopters descending on Caracas in the pre-dawn darkness of 2026, and the haunting question: will this reshape international relations the way the Roosevelt Corollary did over a century ago? And if so, toward what kind of world are we heading?